cardboard box was not heavy. That was the thing Marcus noticed first, how light it was. Coffee mug. A phone charger coiled like a sleeping snake. A small framed photograph of a girl with gap-toothed smile and paint on her chin. A wrench, wrapped in a shop cloth, laid carefully on top of everything else the way you'd lay a blanket over something you wanted to protect. That was it. 11 years at Hale Motorsport, and everything that belonged to him fit inside a box he could carry with one hand. He stood in the corridor outside the CEO's office and looked down at it. Behind him, through the glass partition, he could hear Donovan Hale already on another call. Voice bright, laughing at something. The meeting that had just ended, the meeting in which Marcus had been told to collect his things and leave the premises before end of business, had apparently not interrupted Donovan's afternoon in any meaningful way. A decision had been made. A box had been produced. The conversation was over. Marcus had not argued. He wasn't sure why exactly. He had the words. He had always had the words. He simply chose most of the time not to spend them. There was a cost to explaining yourself to people who had already decided what you were. He had learned that early, and he had never unlearned it. So he stood in the corridor, box in hand, and let the moment settle around him the way dust settles after something falls. The official reason, as Donovan had stated it calmly, with the particular crispness of a man accustomed to delivering bad news without touching it, was unauthorized modification of company property. Those were the exact words. Unauthorized modification. As though Marcus had vandalized something. As though what he had done on his lunch break in 40 minutes with a pocket multi-tool and a set of hands that had been solving mechanical problems since before Donovan Hale had his first corporate business card, was an act of sabotage rather than an act of care. The car in question was the team's primary race vehicle, a machine that had been misfiring intermittently for 11 weeks. Marcus had watched 11 weeks of engineers run diagnostics and reach conclusions and implement corrections and stand back while the problem persisted. He had watched it the way a surgeon might watch someone apply a bandage to a wound that needed stitches, with patience, because it wasn't his place to say so, and with a private and growing certainty about exactly what was wrong. On Tuesday, he had his lunch in the garage bay as he always did. Tupperware container on the workbench, thermos of coffee beside it, and he had looked at the car for a long time. Then he had put down his fork, wiped his hands, picked up his tool and fixed it. The whole process took less time than his lunch break. He torqued the last fastener back into place at 12:54 and was back at his station by 1. He had not told anyone. There was no report filed, no credit sought, no conversation initiated. He simply fixed the thing because it was broken and he knew how and the opportunity was in front of him. That was the entire logic of it. Someone had noticed by Wednesday morning. The car had run cleaner in the test session than it had in 3 months. Questions were asked. Video footage from the garage was reviewed. Marcus's lunch break appeared on a timestamp. The pocket tool was mentioned. By Thursday afternoon, he was sitting across from Donovan Hale, who had the bearing of a man delivering a verdict he found personally distasteful but professionally necessary. "We have protocols," Donovan had said. "Every modification to a race vehicle goes through engineering review. Full stop. It doesn't matter whether the outcome was positive. You bypassed the process. That's a liability issue and a chain of custody issue and frankly a trust issue." Marcus had looked at the desk between them. It was very clean. There was a scale model of one of the team's championship cars on the corner of it, posed on a small wooden plinth. He recognized the suspension geometry. He recognized the cooling configuration. He recognized, in the miniature precision of that little replica, the geometry of solutions he had arrived at a long time ago, in a different life, for a different team, for reasons that had nothing to do with trophies. He did not say this. He said, "The misfire was a microfracture in the harmonic balancer. The timing variance was throwing the cylinder sequencing by about 3 degrees under load. It's fixed." Donovan had looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has been given information he doesn't know how to convert into anything useful. Then he had looked back at the paper in front of him. "That may be," he said, "but the process exists for a reason." The box had appeared shortly afterward, carried in by someone from HR whom Marcus did not know well, a young woman who couldn't quite meet his eyes when she set it on the table, which he noted and did not hold against her. She was doing her job. Everyone in this building was doing their job. That was the particular loneliness of moments like this. Everyone was behaving correctly and the outcome was still wrong. He packed his things in about 3 minutes. The coffee mug. His daughter had given it to him for Father's Day 2 years ago. Painted it herself at one of those ceramic studios. Her name along the side in uneven letters. A car painted in green because she knew her father liked cars even though she didn't entirely understand why. He wrapped it in a paper towel from the dispenser on the wall and placed it in the box. The phone charger. The small motivational calendar on his desk that he had never once found motivating, but had kept because Lily had bought it at a school fundraiser and presented it to him with the seriousness of someone delivering an important document. Then the wrench. He kept it in the bottom drawer of his desk, wrapped in a blue shop cloth that he rewrapped every few months when the old one wore thin. It was not a remarkable-looking tool matte finish worn at the grip, the kind of object that looks like it has been used for its actual purpose rather than displayed. He had owned it for 22 years. He had carried it through 2 countries, 3 teams, for garages, and one life that had pivoted completely when a small person arrived in it and rearranged every priority he had ever held. He placed it on top of everything else in the box. Then he picked the box up, light, embarrassingly light, nothing weight, and walked out of the office, through the door held open by the HR woman, and into the corridor. That was where he stopped. Not from hesitation. Not from any intention to make a scene or deliver a final word or stand in the fluorescent corridor light long enough for someone important to notice and feel something. He stopped simply because the body sometimes needs a moment when the mind is processing more than it can process quickly. He stood with the box and breathed once, slowly, through his nose. Through the glass partition, Donovan Hale laughed at something on his phone call. Down the corridor, 2 engineers Marcus knew by name were walking toward the fabrication floor, deep in conversation, eyes down on a tablet between them. They passed without looking up. This was not unkindness. This was just the texture of a busy workplace on a Thursday afternoon. The world continuing at its ordinary pace while something quietly significant happened just to the left of everyone's attention. Marcus looked down at the box one more time. The photograph of Lily sat on top of the wrapped wrench. She was 7 in the photo, that age where children smile with their whole face, every muscle involved, nothing held back. She had paint on her chin from a school project. She was wearing a yellow t-shirt. She had no idea in that photograph that the world was the kind of place that put people in corridors with cardboard boxes. She would learn eventually. They all learned eventually, but not yet. He shifted the box to his other arm. Then Marcus Ellison, who had built championship race cars with his own hands and walked away from the sport that loved him for the daughter who needed him, who had fixed an engine on his lunch break out of nothing but instinct and conscience and 30 years of knowing exactly what was wrong and how to make it right, walked toward the exit. He did not look back. He had somewhere to be before school pickup. He picked Lily up at 3:15, same as every day. She came through the school gate the way she always did, backpack bouncing, one sock higher than the other, already talking before she reached him, mid-sentence about something that had happened at lunch involving a disagreement over whose turn it was to name the class hamster. Marcus listened the way he always listened, fully, without the distracted half-attention that children can always detect, the kind where the adult's eyes are present but their mind is somewhere down the road. He listened like she was telling him something important, because she was. It was always important. That had been his rule since the beginning. Since the very first day he had been the only one picking her up. Everything she tells you is important. Remember that. Don't let the weight of everything else make you forget that. He had made that rule for himself on a Tuesday in March, 5 years ago, standing in this same spot outside these same gates, the first time he had done the pickup alone. Elena had left on a Sunday. She had been honest about it, at least. There had been no deception, no discovered secret, no sudden rupture. There had been, instead, a slow and honest conversation that had been happening in pieces over many months, and which had finally arrived at its conclusion. She was not happy. She did not know how to become happy in the life they had built. She loved Lily completely and without qualification, and she and Marcus had spent 3 weeks working out an arrangement that put Lily at the center of everything, which was the one thing they had never disagreed on. Then Elena had moved to another city for work, and Marcus had stood in the kitchen of their house on a Sunday evening after Lily was in bed, and he had looked at the refrigerator with its crayon drawings held up by fruit-shaped magnets, and he had thought, all right then, just us. He had not been bitter. He wanted to be clear about that. Not for Elena's sake, not for anyone else's, but for his own. Bitterness was a thing he couldn't afford. Bitterness required energy and attention and the kind of ongoing interior negotiation that took up space he needed for other things. He had grieved quietly and privately, in the way that men of a certain temperament grieve. Not loudly, not visibly, but genuinely, in the early mornings before Lily woke, in the 15 minutes between the end of her bedtime and the beginning of sleep. He gave himself those 15 minutes. Then he moved forward. Moving forward meant learning things he had not previously needed to know. He learned how to braid hair. This took longer than he expected and involved several YouTube tutorials and one morning where Lily arrived at school with something that could generously be described as a plate and more accurately described as an ambitious attempt. He kept practicing. Within 2 months he could produce something that passed inspection. By the end of the first year he had developed a signature style, 2 French braids, slightly asymmetric, which Lily declared was actually better than most of the other options. A verdict he accepted with the quiet pride of a man who has genuinely earned something. He learned the school schedule, the curriculum nights and the bake sale dates and the names of every teacher and the particular social dynamics of Lily's friend group, which were, he discovered, extraordinarily complex for a group of 7-year-olds and required careful navigation. He learned which days she needed the green lunchbox versus the blue one, a distinction whose logic he never fully decoded but whose importance he never questioned. He learned how to be both things at once, the parent who was present and the professional who was reliable. This was, of all the things he learned, the hardest. Not because either role was beyond him, but because the logistics of being both, alone, every day with no margin for error, required a kind of quiet organizational precision that exhausted him in ways he never admitted. He set alarms. He made lists. He kept a calendar on the kitchen wall with color-coded entries. Blue for Lily's school events, red for his work schedule, green for anything that required advanced preparation. The calendar was always full. There was never a blank week. What made it manageable, what made it more than manageable, what made it, on the best days, genuinely good, was Lily herself. She was, by any honest accounting, an extraordinary child. Not in the way parents say their children are extraordinary, meaning they love them completely, though Marcus loved her completely, past the point of language, past the point of any measurement he had access to. She was extraordinary in the specific and observable sense that she paid attention to the world in a way that most people, adults included, did not. She noticed things. She asked questions that arrived at angles he hadn't anticipated. She had, at 8 years old, a capacity for empathy that he found quietly astonishing, the ability to understand that other people had interior lives as real and complicated as her own, a thing that many adults never fully grasped. She also had, it must be said, a remarkable ability to locate the one loose thread in any argument he made and pull it until the whole thing unraveled. This she had not gotten from him. This was entirely her own. He had built his life around her schedule so completely and so naturally that he sometimes forgot it had ever been arranged differently. The early shifts, he took them because they ended in time for school pickup and no other reason. The lunches in the garage bay because the lunch break was shorter than the drive to anywhere worth eating, and the money saved meant a better coat for Lily in winter. The quiet, methodical pace of his days, because a man raising a child alone learns quickly that drama is expensive and steadiness is a gift you give the person who depends on you. His colleagues at Hale Motorsport knew him as reliable and private. They knew he had a daughter. They had seen the photograph on his desk. A few of them knew, in the vague way that workplace knowledge travels, that he was doing it alone. None of them knew the full dimensions of what that meant, the infrastructure of care and precision and daily recommitment that held a child's world together when there was only one person holding it. And none of them, not one person in that building, knew the other thing, the thing that Marcus had never found a reason to mention. Not from shame, not from secrecy, simply because the past was the past and the present needed his full attention, and because the kind of man who introduces himself by listing his accomplishments was not a kind of man he had ever wanted to be. What they didn't know was this: before Lily, before Elena, before the Tupperware lunches and the color-coded calendar and the asymmetric French braids, there had been a different version of Marcus Ellison. Not a different person exactly. The The same mind, the same hands, the same quality of attention, but differently deployed, pointed at a different problem, operating at a scale that bore no resemblance to a garage bay in a mid-tier motorsport company. For 10 years, from his mid-20s to his mid-30s, in the compressed and intense world of championship-level racing, Marcus had been the lead fabrication engineer for a team that won, repeatedly, consequentially, in ways that people in that industry still referenced when they talked about the evolution of the sport. He had not been the face of the team. He had never been the face of anything. He was the person behind the face, the one in the fabrication bay at 2 in the morning, working through a suspension geometry problem that had been bothering him for a week, emerging at 6 with a solution that changed the way the car handled through a corner. The patents he filed during those years sat in a database somewhere, quietly attached to his name, referenced by engineers in the industry who had no idea the same man was currently eating a packed lunch in a garage bay and asking no one for anything. He had walked away from that world when Lily was 3, and it became clear that the schedule, the travel, the race weeks, the relentless demand of a sport that treated normal human needs as inconveniences, was incompatible with being the father she needed him to be. He had made that choice without drama. He had never unmade it. He had never, in 11 years at Hale Motorsport, told anyone what he used to be. There had never seemed to be a good reason to. Until now, it had never seemed to matter. Donovan Hale had not always been this. That was the thing worth understanding. The thing that made him, in a certain light, more troubling than a simple villain and more recognizable than anyone wanted to admit. He had not arrived in the world as a man who fired quietly brilliant people without asking the right questions. He had been built into that shape incrementally by the particular pressures of a particular kind of success. He had grown up in a household where ambition was the primary language. His father had been a self-made man in the rigid, unforgiving sense of the phrase. A man who had clawed a manufacturing business out of nothing and spent the rest of his life making sure his son understood exactly what that had cost. The lesson Donovan absorbed was not the one his father intended to teach. His father meant to communicate the value of hard work. What Donovan heard, repeated in 100 different registers over 20 years, was something slightly different. The person at the top of the room is the only person in the room who matters. He had carried that lesson with him, unconsciously and completely, into every room he had subsequently entered. He was not unintelligent. That was important to establish clearly. A stupid man could not have done what Donovan had done, built a motorsport company from a presentation deck and a set of investor relationships into something with championship wins and brand sponsorships and a media presence that punched above its technical weight. It required intelligence. It required relentless energy and the particular skill of making people believe in something before it existed. It required vision of a kind. What it did not require, what it had, in fact, never asked of him, was the capacity to look past the surface of things, to wonder what was underneath, to ask how rather than simply whether. He had hired for credentials, always. If a CV showed the right schools and the right previous employers and arrived attached to a person who presented well in a meeting, Donovan felt confident. He trusted the external markers because they were legible to him, and because they had, by and large, delivered results. He did not trust things that were harder to read, things like quiet competence or undocumented expertise, or the kind of knowledge that lives in a person's hands rather than on their resume. Marcus, when he had been hired 11 years ago, hired by a department head who had since left, not by Donovan himself, had come in through a side door of Donovan's attention. His paperwork listed his current experience, his most recent references, the practical mechanical qualifications he held. The earlier chapters, the championship years, the patents, the decade of engineering work that had shaped the technical language of the sport were not listed because Marcus had not listed them. He had applied for a fabrication role, and his qualifications for a fabrication role were sufficient, and that had been the end of the conversation. Donovan had met him twice in 11 years. He knew his face in the way that you know the faces of people you pass regularly in corridors, present in the peripheral vision, located in a general category, never brought into full focus. Workshop staff. One of the older ones. Quiet. This was not hostility. Donovan bore Marcus no specific ill will. He bore him, which was in some ways worse, a complete and undifferentiated indifference. Marcus existed in a category of people that Donovan had long ago filed under execution as opposed to vision, and Donovan concerned himself with vision. The distinction he drew between the people who decided things and the people who built things was so fundamental to his understanding of how organizations worked that he had never once examined it. He had built his identity as a visionary. The photographs told the story clearly. Donovan at race events, Donovan at press conferences, Donovan beside the car, hand on the hood, looking at something in the middle distance with the expression of a man who sees further than other men. He had cultivated that image carefully, and it had served him well. Investors responded to it. Journalists reproduced it. His team had come to organize themselves around it. The story he told about his company was the story of his vision. The technical innovations that had made the team competitive, the suspension approach, the aerodynamic philosophy, the engine cooling geometry that had given them a measurable edge in warm weather circuits, existed in his telling as expressions of team excellence. His team, his philosophy, his investment in the right people and the right processes. He had never looked closely enough at those innovations to ask where, specifically, they had come from. He trusted that the people below him had developed them. He trusted the results. He did not feel the need to trace the river back to its source. This was not malice. But it was a kind of violence, nonetheless, the slow, structural violence of a person who has arranged the world so that certain people remain permanently invisible to him, and who has never once been asked to look. The decision to fire Marcus had taken him less than 20 minutes. The misfire issue had been irritating him for weeks, not technically because he didn't engage with it technically, but reputationally. A car that misfired was a story that journalists might pick up, a vulnerability that sponsors might notice, an imperfection in the image he was building toward the upcoming race. When the footage showed Marcus at the car during his lunch break, the decision crystallized quickly through the lens Donovan always used: process violation, liability, precedent. He had framed it to himself as a matter of standards. The company had protocols. Protocols existed for reasons. Allowing a workshop employee to modify a race vehicle without authorization, regardless of outcome, set a precedent that could not be allowed. He had delivered the news cleanly. He always delivered news cleanly. It was one of his genuine skills, the ability to communicate a decision in a way that felt final and reasonable and stripped of personal feeling. He had looked at Marcus across the desk and seen a man who was in the wrong, procedurally, and whose presence in the company was now a complication that needed to be resolved. He had not looked further than that. He had not asked, why does this man know exactly what was wrong with our car? He had not asked, how did he fix it so quickly, and what does that tell us about what he knows? He had closed the meeting and taken his next call and let the afternoon continue. He had not thought about Marcus again until the following Monday, when a car that was supposed to be ready for qualifying was still misfiring, worse now, somehow, as though the brief window of correct function had been a courtesy the machine had extended, which was now being withdrawn. His engineering team gathered in the garage that afternoon with tablets and diagnostic software and the careful language of people who are trying hard not to admit they don't know the answer. Donovan stood with his arms folded and watched them. He had a journalist arriving Wednesday for a feature. He had sponsors flying in Thursday. The race was Sunday. He looked at the car. He thought briefly of Marcus's words in the meeting. The misfire was a microfracture in the harmonic balancer. The timing variance was throwing the cylinder sequencing by about 3 degrees under load. It's fixed. He had dismissed those words at the time as beside the point. The point had been the protocol violation. The fix, whatever it was incidental. Standing in the garage now, watching his engineers argue over a problem that one quiet man had apparently solved in 40 minutes on his lunch break, Donovan felt the first faint movement of something he was not accustomed to feeling. He did not yet have a name for it. He turned away from the car. He had a dinner to prepare for. The feeling followed him out. Callum found the note on a Tuesday evening, alone in the archive room, with a cold coffee and the specific exhaustion of someone who has been solving the wrong problem for too long. He was 29. He had been the team's lead race engineer for 2 years, young for the role, competent in ways that he was still discovering, honest enough with himself to know when he was out of his depth. He was out of his depth now. The harmonic balancer was back on the bench in front of him, the diagnostic software open on the laptop beside it, and the car he was responsible for putting on the grid in 5 days, was not behaving the way a car should behave. He had started from scratch that morning. Not because he thought the previous engineering team's work had been wrong, but because starting from scratch was sometimes the only way to find what had been missed. He pulled every maintenance log entry filed on the car in the past 6 months. He printed them. He spread them across the table in chronological order and began to read. Most of them were routine. Tire changes, fluid checks, brake pad measurements, the administrative language of a well-maintained machine, precise, impersonal, functional. And then, near the back of the stack, 3 weeks old, filed under a general maintenance date, a handwritten note. The handwriting was neat and dense, the kind of writing that has been trained by years of recording technical observations in small spaces. The note ran to 12 lines. In those 12 lines, Marcus had described the misfire fault with a precision that stopped Callum mid-breath. Not the vague directional language of someone guessing, possible timing issue, recommend further investigation. The full diagnosis, the specific fault, the mechanism by which it was causing the timing variance, the exact nature of the harmonic balancer fracture and the load conditions under which it expressed. A complete, self-contained technical record of a problem that Callum's team had been circling for 11 weeks. Signed with an employee ID number at the bottom. Callum looked at the ID number. Then he looked at it again. He knew whose number it was. He looked at the date. He did the arithmetic. Marcus had written this note 2 weeks before he fixed the problem. He had identified the fault in full, filed it quietly in the maintenance log, and then waited, apparently, to see whether anyone would act on it. When no one did, he had fixed it himself. Callum put the note down on the table and sat with that for a moment. Then he started pulling everything else. Every log entry Marcus had filed in 5 years. There were more than he expected. Dozens of handwritten notes, tucked into maintenance records, attached to service reports, filed in the margins of broader inspection documents. He read them in order. The pattern that emerged was, once he saw it, impossible to mistake. 6 separate engineering problems in 5 years, not minor issues, not routine maintenance variances, but genuine technical problems that had been affecting car performance in measurable ways, had been identified and corrected by Marcus before the engineering team formally acknowledged them. In each case, the correction had appeared in the maintenance record. In each case, no formal report had been filed, no credit claimed, no conversation initiated. He had simply seen the problems and fixed them and moved on. Callum leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Then he did something that surprised himself. He started searching the championship archives. He was not entirely sure what he was looking for. Something in the density of Marcus's technical language, the specificity of the vocabulary, the confidence of the diagnosis, the way he described mechanical behavior, the way a poet describes something they have looked at for a very long time, had triggered a recognition he couldn't quite locate. This was not the technical language of a fabrication operative. This was the language of someone who had spent years engineering at a higher level than his current job description suggested. The championship archive database was publicly accessible. He searched Marcus's name. The first result was a photograph. It was 21 years old. A team photo from a championship-winning season, the kind of photograph that gets framed and mounted in motorsport halls of recognition. The car, the team, and among them, younger, leaner, with the particular look of someone who has not yet learned to be tired, but unmistakably the same face, the same quality of stillness, Marcus. The caption listed him as lead fabrication engineer. Callum clicked through to the technical record of that season. The innovations that had made that car historically significant, the suspension geometry that had been written about in engineering journals, the cooling system configuration that had become a reference point for subsequent designs, the aerodynamic approach that other teams had spent years trying to reverse engineer, each one traced back to patents filed by Marcus J. Ellison. He sat in the archive room for a long time after that. The cold coffee sat untouched at his elbow. The maintenance logs were spread across the table. The photograph was open on the screen. He thought about the cardboard box. He thought about the fluorescent corridor. He thought about a man who had carried 20 years of championship-level expertise into a fabrication bay and spent 11 years using it to write handwritten notes in the margins of maintenance records that no one read. He thought about the car on the other side of the wall, still misfiring, and the race 5 days away, and the engineering team that was no closer to an answer than they had been at the start of the week. Then he gathered the documents carefully, stacked them in order, and carried them down the corridor to Donovan's office. He knocked once. He went in. He set the folder on the desk without saying anything and waited for Donovan to open it. Donovan opened the folder the way he opened most documents, efficiently, with the posture of someone who processes information quickly and moves on. He was halfway through the first page before his posture changed. Changed slowly. Not dramatically. There was no moment where he sat back and put his head in his hands, no visible collapse. It was subtler than that. His shoulders descended about half an inch. The set of his jaw altered. He turned the pages at a different pace than he had started with, slower, with the quality of attention that arrives when you realize you are reading something that is going to require you to revise a position you were not aware of holding. Callum stood across the desk and said nothing. He had decided, on the walk down the corridor, that the documents would speak and he would not. He was right about that. Donovan read the maintenance logs first. He read them carefully. More carefully than Callum had expected, given that technical documentation was not ordinarily the medium through which Donovan engaged with the world. But he read them. He followed Marcus's handwritten diagnoses with a finger along the page, tracing the logic. He was not an engineer, but he was not unintelligent, and the intelligence of what he was reading was apparent even without the technical vocabulary to fully decode it. He turned to the championship archive materials. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at the patent records. The filings, dated across a decade, attached to innovations that Callum had been careful to cross-reference with Hale Motorsport's own technical foundations. The proprietary approaches that formed the bedrock of the company's competitive identity. The things Donovan cited in investor presentations as evidence of the team's engineering sophistication. His engineering sophistication. His team. Callum watched him reach that section. Watched him stop. Watched him read it again. Donovan closed the folder. He placed both hands flat on the desk in front of him, a gesture that seemed to be about maintaining contact with something solid. "How long have you had this?" he asked. "About an hour," Callum said. Donovan nodded. He looked at the folder. He looked at the wall. There was a championship photograph on the wall, his company, his car, his moment. He had looked at it almost every day for 4 years, and it had always looked the same. It looked different now. Not because anything in it had changed. Because the context around it had shifted, and context, it turned out, changed the picture entirely. He said, "The car. Still misfiring," Callum said. "Worse than yesterday, actually. We think the original repair may have partially addressed a secondary issue that we hadn't identified, and now that it's..." "How long until the race?" "5 days. Donovan stood up. He walked to the window. The office had a view down onto the main garage floor, a detail of the building's layout that had always pleased him, the sense of surveying the operation from above. He looked down at the garage. The car was on the lift. 3 engineers stood around it with the body language of people in disagreement. He could not hear them, but he could read the posture clearly enough. Nobody was confident. Nobody had the answer. He had scheduled a press briefing for Thursday. The journalist who was coming for the feature, a senior motorsport correspondent from a publication that reached the demographic his sponsors most cared about, would be on site from Wednesday afternoon. There would be photographs. There would be track sessions. There would be the specific visual grammar of a company in confident preparation for something important. And the car could not complete a clean lap. He thought about the conversation he had had in this room 5 days ago. The man sitting across the desk from him. The flat, uninflected precision of what he had said, not delivered as an argument or a credential, just stated as information, the way a person states something they simply know to be true. The misfire was a microfracture in the harmonic balancer. The timing variance was throwing the cylinder sequencing by about 3 degrees under load. It's fixed. And Donovan had said, "That may be. But the process exists for a reason." He had been right about the process. That was the thing he kept returning to, with the slightly desperate quality of a man looking for the ground beneath his feet. The process did exist for a reason. Unauthorized modifications to race vehicles were a genuine liability issue. He had not been wrong to enforce the protocol. What he had been, And this was the thing the documents on his desk made inescapably, physically clear. What he had been was catastrophically incurious. He had enforced the rule without asking the question that the rule could not answer. Who is this man and what does he know? He had fired the answer and kept the problem. The garage floor below him offered nothing. The engineers moved around the car with their tablets and their uncertainty. A junior team member came in with coffee and set it down and left. The fluorescent lights were very bright, and in that brightness the car looked exactly like what it was. A beautiful broken machine that needed someone who understood it. Donovan turned from the window. "There's something else," Callum said. He placed a second sheet on the desk. A printed email, sent from an address Callum had tracked through the HR system. Timestamped the morning after Marcus was let go. An inquiry from a rival motorsport team, a well-funded, well-organized rival, one that Donovan was aware of and specifically wary of, asking whether Marcus might be available for a consultancy conversation. Someone had moved quickly. Someone in the industry had seen what happened, or heard about it through the tight and gossipy channels through which personnel news traveled in this world, and had immediately understood something that Donovan had not taken the time to understand. Donovan looked at the email. He looked at it for a long time. He was not a man who experienced regret easily. Regret required a kind of retrospective vulnerability that his psychology did not naturally produce. He was better at forward motion than backward examination, better at deciding what to do next than at sitting with the weight of what had already been done. But standing in his office with the folder open on his desk and the email beside it and the car misfiring 2 floors below and the journalist arriving in 48 hours, he felt something move through him that he recognized, with some effort, as the specific and unpleasant sensation of having made a serious mistake. Not the procedural mistake. He could defend the procedural mistake. The process was real. The protocol was real. The mistake was the question he hadn't asked. The mistake was every question he hadn't asked in 11 years of walking past a man in a corridor, for 11 years of filing him under execution rather than vision, for 11 years of arranging his world so that certain people stayed permanently in his peripheral vision and never came into focus. He sat back down. Outside, somewhere down the corridor, a phone was ringing and not being answered. He thought about the rival team's inquiry email. He thought about the time it would take to bring another engineer up to speed on the car's systems. He thought about Thursday's journalist and the sponsors on Friday and the race on Sunday and the gap, the yawning, quiet, deeply inconvenient gap between the story he had been telling about this company and the story the archive folder on his desk was telling instead. He thought about the wrench. He hadn't registered it at the time. It had been a detail at the periphery of a meeting he was moving through quickly. But it came back to him now with the odd precision of a detail that the brain records without permission. Marcus, packing his box, wrapping something in a cloth. Careful about it. Unhurried. The way you handle something that has been with you a long time. He said, "Does he still answer his phone?" Callum looked at him. "I don't know," he said. "But I think that depends on what you say when he picks up." Donovan nodded once. He opened his desk drawer and took out his phone. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man preparing to do something he does not entirely know how to do. Then he found the number. He pressed call. The phone rang 4 times. Marcus was at the kitchen table when it rang, helping Lily with a school project about bridges which had evolved, as her projects tended to, into something more ambitious than the assignment required. She had decided to build a working model from popsicle sticks and string, and the engineering logic of tension and compression was presenting itself as a genuine problem that she was approaching with great seriousness. He was explaining the concept of load distribution in the simplest language he had, and she was listening with the focused expression she wore when something was clicking into place and the phone rang. He looked at the screen. He recognized the number from the company's main directory. Not Donovan's direct line, but close enough to it that he knew where the call was coming from. He looked at it for 2 full rings. Lily glanced up from the bridge, registered that something was happening, and looked back down with the instinctive tact of a child who has learned to read her parents' pauses. He answered on the 4th ring. Donovan spoke first, which Marcus had expected. What he had not expected was the register. Not the clean, processed delivery of the man who had handed him a cardboard box, but something different, quieter, less produced. A man choosing words more carefully than usual because he was less certain than usual about where they were landing. He said he had seen the archive documents. He said Callum had put the folder on his desk and he had read it and he needed Marcus to know that he understood what it contained. He said he was aware that what he was about to ask required something from Marcus that Marcus had no obligation to give. He said the car was still broken and the race was 5 days away and he had engineers who were trying and falling short and he used that word needed without qualifier or cushion. He needed someone who understood the machine the way Marcus understood it. He did not say we'd like to offer you your position back. Not yet. He said the thing before the thing. He said we built this on your work and I didn't know it and I should have asked and I didn't and I am asking now. Marcus stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. The evening light was coming in at a low angle, laying itself across the floor in long pale strips. From Lily's room, he could see the glow of the night light under the door. She'd left it on since she was 4. A small yellow moon that he'd replaced the bulb of twice. He looked at the light under the door and listened to the voice on the phone and let the silence sit for a moment before he answered. He did not perform the silence. He simply needed it. He thought about what was being asked. He was being asked to walk back into a building that had put him in a corridor with a cardboard box. He was being asked to fix, again, a problem he had already identified and already solved, for people who had not been curious enough to ask how he had done it the first time. He was being asked to give something to a man who had taken something from him without sufficient thought. All of that was true. Also true. The car deserved to run properly. Machines were not responsible for the politics of the people who owned them. The harmonic balancer fault was a real problem with a real solution, and it bothered something fundamental in his engineering nature to know that it was sitting unsolved in a garage 2 miles away. Also true, Callum had been honest. Callum had done the thing that took more courage than Donovan's phone call. He had gone into the archives without being asked, followed the evidence without knowing where it led, and brought the folder to the right person without editorializing. That kind of honesty deserved something in return. Also true, and most importantly, Lily was at the kitchen table building a bridge and the light was under her door and the world outside this window would be there regardless of what he decided. And what mattered most was not the decision itself but what he was teaching her about the shape of a person, by being the shape of a person every day in the choices no one else would see him make. He turned back from the window. "I'll come," he said. "Not for the company. For Callum and for the car. I'll be there at 5. Donovan said, "Thank you." Marcus said, "I know." He ended the call and stood for a moment in the kitchen, then walked back to the table and sat down beside Lily and the bridge. "Everything okay?" she asked, without looking up from the popsicle sticks. "Yes," he said. "Do you have to go somewhere tomorrow?" "Early. Before you're up. I'll leave breakfast on the table." She nodded. She had the expression of someone doing advanced mental arithmetic about tension ratios. "Okay," she said. "Can you hold this piece while I tie the string?" He held the piece. She tied the string. The bridge held. He arrived at the garage at 4:57 the following morning. The building was quiet, the overnight crew had finished, the day staff hadn't started, and the car sat in the bay under a single work light with the particular solitude of machines that are waiting for the right person. He put on the overalls someone had left folded on the bench. He picked up his tools. He found the harmonic balancer in 12 minutes. He worked in the specific silence of someone who has done something so many times that the doing is no longer separate from the thinking, hands and mind operating as a single system, no hesitation, no second-guessing, no performance. 2 hours and 11 minutes after he arrived, the engine turned over clean. He stayed long enough to run it twice. Then he folded the overalls, set them on the bench, and walked out before the morning shift arrived. He stopped at the bakery on the corner. He bought a chocolate croissant and a coffee. He had somewhere to be before she woke up. Lily woke up at 7:14, as she almost always did, with the specific internal clock of a child who has never needed an alarm. She came into the kitchen in her pajamas, the ones with the small planets on them, Saturn and Jupiter in faded blues and yellows from too many washes, and her hair in the particular state of the morning, which was somewhere between a braid that had survived the night and a decision she'd need to negotiate with a mirror. She was carrying, for reasons Marcus had long since stopped questioning, a single sock, which she set on the counter as though it were an object she intended to return to later. She saw the plate on the table. The chocolate croissant sat on the blue plate, the good one, the ceramic one Lily had made at the school art fair 2 years ago, that Marcus used for things that deserved a proper plate. Beside it, the orange juice. And beneath the juice glass, a note in Marcus's handwriting. The small, precise letters that matched the handwriting in the maintenance logs, the championship notes, the margin corrections that no one had read for 11 years. She picked up the note. Back before you woke up. Fixed something this morning. Nothing special. Orange juice is fresh. Don't forget it's library day. Dad. She read it twice, the way children read handwritten notes, as though the handwriting itself carries information beyond the words. Then she set it back on the table, carefully, under the glass where she'd found it, and sat down and ate the croissant with both hands and looked out the window at the morning. The race was on Sunday. Marcus watched it from the kitchen, on his laptop, with the sound low so as not to wake Lily, who had been allowed to stay up late the night before on the basis of the bridge project reaching a critical structural phase. He watched the car come onto the grid. He watched the warm-up lap. He watched the engine telemetry data on the broadcast graphic, clean, consistent, the timing variance gone, the power curve expressing itself exactly as it should. He drank his coffee. He did not feel the things the story might suggest he should feel in that moment, triumph or vindication, or the particular pleasure of being proven right in front of the people who had dismissed him. He felt something quieter and more private than any of those things. He felt the satisfaction of a problem correctly solved. The same satisfaction he had felt at 4:57 in the morning, listening to the engine turn over clean. That satisfaction belonged to him and to the machine and to the work itself, and it did not need an audience or a narrative or anyone's acknowledgement to be real. The formal letter arrived on Monday. It came by post, which surprised him, an actual letter, in an envelope with the company's logo in the corner, which he found in the mailbox between a school newsletter and a takeout menu. He opened it at the kitchen table after Lily left for school. It was from Donovan. It was 3 pages long. The first page was the offer, senior engineering consultancy, his own terms, his name attached publicly to the team's technical record going back to the innovations he had contributed, a financial package that bore no resemblance to what he had been earning. The second page was the apology. Donovan had written it himself, Marcus could tell, because the language had none of the smooth precision of a professionally composed document. It had the halting, self-interrupting quality of a person writing something they are not entirely sure how to write, which made it more honest than a polished version would have been. He acknowledged the archive findings. He acknowledged 11 years of incuriosity. He used the word wrong twice without qualification. The third page was a note from Callum. Short. 3 paragraphs. He wrote about finding the maintenance logs, what it had felt like to read them, to trace the pattern of quiet corrections made and never claimed. He wrote about the photograph in the archive. He wrote, in the final paragraph, something that Marcus read and then read again. I don't know why you never said anything about who you were. I think I understand it, but I don't know if I could have done it. I want you to know that someone in that building knew. That someone looked at the record and understood what it meant. I hope that's worth something. Marcus folded the letter carefully. He went to the kitchen drawer, the one beside the refrigerator, the one that held the things that mattered without mattering in any way that could be explained to someone who didn't already understand. Lily's drawings from when she was 4, kept in a folded envelope. The hospital bracelet from the night she had a fever and he had sat in the waiting room for 3 hours reciting to himself every fact he knew about childhood viral infections and finding them insufficient. A photograph of his own father, taken outdoors, squinting into the sun, before things became complicated between them. And at the back of the drawer, wrapped in its blue shop cloth, the wrench. He placed the letter in the drawer, beside the wrench. He stood for a moment with the drawer open. 22 years that wrench had traveled with him. Through the championship garages and the design tables and the fabrication bays. Through the marriage and the birth and the leaving and the raising. Through 11 years of early shifts and Tupperware lunches and asymmetric French braids and color-coded calendars and everything that life had required of him since he turned toward the smaller, more important thing and did not look back. He had never needed the wrench to prove anything. That was the point of the wrench and the point of the drawer and the point of him. It was not a trophy. It was not evidence. It was a tool that had been used for the purpose it was made for, by hands that understood it, for all the years it was needed. That was enough. That had always been enough. He closed the drawer. He picked up his keys and his jacket. He had a school pickup in 3 hours. Between now and then, there was a trip to the hardware store because the bridge Lily had built from popsicle sticks and string, whose tension ratio she had argued about with the focus of a structural engineer, had inspired a follow-up project involving a pulley system whose ambition somewhat exceeded the materials currently available in the apartment. He had promised to help source the right gauge of cord. He locked the front door. On the walk to the car, he passed the bakery where he had stopped on Thursday morning. The same woman was behind the counter. She gave him the small nod of recognition that regular customers exchange. He had been stopping there for 3 years. She knew his order. She knew he usually came in either very early or not until afternoon. She did not know why, and he had never explained, and it didn't matter. He nodded back. He drove to the hardware store. He spent 20 minutes in the cord aisle, selecting the right gauge with the same quality of attention he gave to all material problems, patient, methodical, tactile. He held several options between his fingers. He made a selection based on tensile strength relative to the load the pulley would carry, which was, by any objective measure, a greater degree of engineering rigor than the project required, and which was also completely in keeping with who he was. He drove to school. He arrived 7 minutes early and stood at the gate in the afternoon light, hands in his jacket pockets, the cord from the hardware store in the bag at his feet, watching the door the way he had watched it every afternoon for 5 years. Other parents arrived. He nodded at the ones he knew. He watched the door. It opened. She came through the gate the way she always did, backpack bouncing, one sock higher than the other, already talking before she reached him. Something about the hamster. Something about a project. Something about whether they could have pasta for dinner, and whether the pulley system could also be made to dispense snacks, which was a separate engineering question but one she had been thinking about. He listened. Fully. The way he always listened. He picked up the bag with the cord. They walked to the car. The letter was in the drawer. The wrench was beside it. The car that he had fixed twice without a title or a ceremony had run clean across the finish line 2 days ago in front of cameras and sponsors and a journalist writing a feature about a company built on a foundation that had a name, finally, attached to it. None of that was here at the gate in the afternoon. What was here was a girl with one sock higher than the other, telling him something important. He listened. That was the whole of it. That had always been the whole of it.